Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Good morning, everyone. Okay, in today's class we will continue with the study of, I think it's chapter 4 in the Buddha's words. And we're dealing now with what can be called the happiness visible in this present life, or the happiness and welfare to be realized here and now. And if you remember, I made a distinction in what I call the 3 levels of teachings in the early discourses of the Buddha. There's what I call the teachings that are directed to happiness visible in this present life, then the teachings which are directed towards happiness in future life, that is, securing a fortunate or good rebirth, and then the teachings which are directed to the ultimate or final good, the teachings concerned with liberation. And even though I make this distinction, I think that there is a distinction visible in the text, but these 3 levels should not be regarded as categories which are each one absolutely enclosed within itself, but the 3 levels blend into each other, so that the teachings which lead to one's welfare here and now also help one develop wholesome qualities that will be productive of a fortunate rebirth, and teachings on both levels will also form the foundation for the practices which constitute the way to the ultimate good, liberation. Okay, last time I dealt with various teachings of the Buddha, general teachings pertaining to this level of well-being and happiness here and now, and then particularly I dealt with the teachings of the Buddha which are related to family life, the responsibilities of children towards their parents, parents towards children, and relations between husbands and wives. Now we come to more general teachings which are directed towards the well-being of lay people. And these teachings begin on page 124. We might call these general teachings concerned with the right way to live in the world. And as a kind of background to this level of teaching, we should say a few words about the transformations that were taking place in society at the time of the Buddha. The most striking feature of the social system of this period in which the Buddha lived was the tremendous expansion of the economy. The small-scale individual cultivation was giving way to large-scale agricultural cultivation. And agriculture had become the pivot or foundation stone of society during this period. Shortly before the time of the Buddha, iron had come into use as a material for producing instruments, tools, even weapons, as well as weapons. So that another characteristic of the period that we'll come to later was the increasing number of wars and the violence of the wars simply because iron was becoming readily available. Okay, so agriculture has become the pivot of the economy. And another feature of the period was the increase in urbanization. In the period, say the Vedic period, the largest settlements were we would call small towns. But with the breakdown of the old Vedic society and the transformation in the time of the Buddha, large cities were arising, and attracting more and more people from the outlying provinces. And so we have large cities like Rajagaha and Savatthi, Kosambi, Varanasi. Sometimes it's said that the Buddha was primarily a forest-dwelling monk. Actually, that's not true. The Buddha was primarily a city-dwelling monk. His main monasteries were outside, just a short distance outside the two major cities of Savatthi, which was somewhat in north central India, and Rajagaha, which was in northeast India. And most of his travels was walking between Rajagaha and Savatthi. And it was the increase in agricultural production that made possible the rise of the cities. Because when there's increased agriculture, then there's a large surplus which can be used to feed people in the cities. As long as agriculture is still in a relatively primitive state, then large cities do not develop. There was also the increase in agricultural production, which made possible the types of movements that the Buddha himself started and which were existing even before him. That is, large companies of young men who would drop out of the production and reproduction systems in order to lead lives as homeless, wandering ascetics. Okay, so from this background, we can come to the first sutta in our selection of texts. This is on page 124. Okay, and at this time, the Buddha was dwelling among the people called the Kolians, at a market town of the Kolians named Katsarapatra. Okay, now the people who are called the Kolians formed a tribal republic which was just to the west of the Sakyan Republic. And the Buddha himself, we say that the Buddha was a Sakyan because his father was a Sakyan, and he grew up in the Sakyan state, But his mother was a Kolya, from the Kolyan state. And so it was common practice in the Buddha's time for members of the different clans, the Kshatriya clans, the administrative or warrior clans, the ruling clans, to intermarry. And so the Buddha's mother, Mahamaya, came from the Kolyan clan. Okay, and at this time a family man or a householder from the Kolyan, his name is Bhikkhu. He comes to the Buddha and he presents a request for teaching. And this is the way he phrases his teaching. He says, Venerable Sir, we are lay people, householders who enjoy sensual pleasures. And this is a kind of stock phrase that one meets often in the text. We dwell at home in a bed crowded with children, since in that period there were not forms of contraception, so families would usually have 5, 6, 7, 8, even more children. You don't have, in that period, it's very rare to have a family with just 2 children. Okay, we enjoy fine sandalwood used to make scents, sweet-smelling scents. We wear garlands, scents, and unguents. We accept gold and silver. This was now becoming, in the Buddha's time, in place of the old barter-based economy, a money economy had arisen. So if there was gold and silver, which was minted in the form of coins used as money. So this family man who's coming and requesting a teaching from the Buddha is here drawing a contrast between their way of life and the way of life of the wandering ascetics, like the Buddha and his disciples. So those who become Buddhist monks, Buddhist nuns, renounce the enjoyment of sensual pleasures. They don't live in a home crowded with children. They don't make use of garlands, perfumes, unguents, and they don't accept gold and silver. And so now he's asking the Buddha, please teach us the Dhamma in a way that is suitable for us, a way that will lead to our welfare and happiness both in the present life and in the future life as well. So here he's asking for teachings that will pertain to what I call the first level, the level concerned with well-being and happiness in this present life, and also for teachings that will be relevant to a happy or fortunate life in the next existence. Okay, and now the Buddha, it seems he had this teaching already sort of prepared, because it's very neatly organized into 2 groups of 4. So he says, first, there are 4 things that lead to the welfare and happiness of a family man, or we could also say a woman, in this very life. What are these 4? He has already 6 labels for them. Accomplishment of persistent effort, accomplishment of protection, good friendship, and balanced living. And then he's going to explain what these 4 things are. First, the accomplishment of persistent effort. Okay, and then he explains that whatever may be the means by which a family man earns his living, and here he enumerates some of the major forms of the major vocations in the Buddha's own time. First, he mentions farming, that is agriculture, trade, cattle raising. Of course, cattle were used especially for the milk products. In India, they use milk a lot, and then from the milk they derive butter, something called curd. I don't know if we have it in this country, but it's very similar to yogurt. It's the thickened milk of the cow. And then also from the purified butter, they prepare ghee, which is very nutritious and very delicious. Okay, then archery, that would be a profession as a kind of warrior, I guess, in the service of the king, or civil service, some kind of government service, or any other craft. Okay, but now the Buddha will then explain the kind of qualities to which a worker should bring to his occupation. In a way, they're very good Protestant virtues. He should be skillful and diligent. Then he should investigate what are the appropriate means, the most effective way to accomplish his work, to accomplish his task. And he should be able to act and to arrange everything properly. Okay, so this means that the layperson living at home with the family should work diligently with, the text uses the expression, persistent effort at his job. Okay, then when he earns money and other forms of exchange, then he has to exercise protection over it. So to secure well-being in this life, he has to achieve what's called the accomplishment of protection, skill and protection. So the family man sets up protection and guard over the wealth acquired by energetic striving, amassed by the strength of his arms, earned by the sweat of his brow. And then the Buddha uses an important phrase. He says it's righteous wealth, righteously gained. This emphasizes the importance of right livelihood in acquiring one's wealth. We'll come to right livelihood, take it up in more detail a little bit later. I think in the Buddha's time already banks were beginning to be established, but probably they were not widely utilized. And so when a person earns wealth, he has to protect it and make sure that it will remain within his possession. And from whom does he have to protect it? Here comes, that is answered in the next statement. How can I prevent kings and bandits from taking this away? See, even in the Buddha's time, the government was closely connected with bandits. The main function of the government, from the standpoint of an ordinary man, is to take away the wealth that I earned by my hard labor. Okay, so those are human sources of deprivation. Then there are the natural sources, two natural sources. Fire, like we had just last week in Southern California, So many people must have lost millions of dollars of wealth through the destructive force of fire. Flood from sweeping it off. Again, like 2 years ago, we had in the southern Delta, New Orleans, Mississippi. Okay, and then a third human source of deprivation, that is from unloved heirs taking it away, probably by bringing up a case of litigation, trying to take, if the person is clever enough and too lazy to work, he'll find a way to sue his rich relatives for the wealth. And also a family man with children wants to make sure that the wealth of the family will be passed on to his children, not to some lackadaisical drunken brother or cousin who will come that never was seen before, but he turns up at the death and says, I'm the next in kin. Okay, then a third source, a third means to happiness and well-being in this present life is to have good friendship, to associate with good friends. We see this quality of good friendship emphasized repeatedly by the Buddha. In relation to the monks also, he will say that to make progress in the training, you should rely on good friends. But here he's telling this family man, he says, in whatever village or town a family man dwells, he associates with householders and their sons, whether young or old, who are of mature virtue, virtuous behavior, who live in accordance with the basic principles of right conduct, who are accomplished in faith, moral discipline, generosity, and wisdom. We will see that these are precisely the qualities that the Buddha is going to recommend as the qualities that lead to well-being and happiness in future life. But when one associates with friends, one should choose people who have these qualities of, at the minimum, faith in the workings of a moral law, faith in the value of spiritual development, and friends who live in accordance with precepts, who are generous, and who have wisdom. Because when one associates with people like that, then their qualities will pass on to you. And then you take them as a model and try to develop these qualities for oneself. And so then the Buddha says that when associating with these people, one should emulate them in regard to their faith, their moral discipline, their generosity, and their wisdom. So that is good friendship. Okay, and then the Buddha speaks, the fourth quality he mentions is what is called balanced living. This means living in a way that is appropriate for one's economic status, for one's wealth, living in a way so that one doesn't overspend, but at the same time that one uses one's wealth in a proper way for beneficial purposes. So it says, here the family man knows his income and expenditures. Again, he's economically mindful, and so he knows how much he is earning, and how much he is spending. He's quite diligent in keeping I don't know whether they had writing in those days, but in some way he must have had a way to keep account of his own resources. And so he leads a balanced life, neither extravagant, that's spending too much so that one exhausts one's wealth, nor miserly. The Buddha doesn't recommend just hoarding one's wealth and just keeping it for oneself and one's family. But one should use one's wealth to give generously to support those who need some financial help and use it for worthy projects, but not spending beyond one's means. Okay, so that one's income will exceed one's expenditures, and that way one will have a surplus for times of emergency. Then the Buddha uses a simile, just the way a goldsmith, when he's weighing gold on a scale, he knows how much the scale is tipped down. That indicates whether there's a lot of gold, or by so much it has tipped up. This means that there's less gold. So just as the goldsmith is able to determine the proper amount of gold that he has by the use of the scale, so the family man lives a balanced life. Okay, and then the Buddha had an astonishingly keen insight into the life of people in society, even though he was living a renunciate life. And in those days there were no newspapers, radio reports, TV news, but still he could understand how people are led astray into dissipating their wealth by living like a spendthrift. So he mentions 4 ways in which people will dissipate the wealth that they've acquired. And he mentions 3 vices. One is womanizing, a married man who goes out with other women and he has to spend money on them to entertain them. Drunkenness, it existed during the Buddha's time, just as it still exists today. Gambling, and evil friendship. If you associate with people who are fond of running around with many women, drinking and gambling, if you associate with that kind of person, then they will lead you into that way of life. Okay, then the Buddha uses a simile to illustrate this. It's always remarkable the way the Buddha has a simile to illustrate each important point. And it's always quite exact, the simile. It's like the case of a tank. You see, in India during the Buddha's time, of course they didn't have modern plumbing the way we have. So to have enough water to get oneself and one's family through the dry season, one always constructs a tank in which one collects the water during the rainy season. And one stores that water in the tank. One uses it for personal use and then for irrigation of the fields. So one has a tank, and the tank will have 4 inlets for collecting the water, 4 outlets through which the water flows. Okay, now if one should close the inlets, the pumps or tubes running into the tank, and open the outlets, and there's not enough rainfall, then what's going to happen to the water in the tank? It runs off and disappears. And so the Buddha says this is just like the person who collects wealth through his living, working diligently, but then, well, if he's not really continuing to earn wealth, but then he takes the wealth that he's earned and then he just spends it recklessly and heedlessly, then he'll just dissipate his wealth. Then in the opposite way, the Buddha says that there are 4 sources for the increase of amassed wealth, or at least for protecting, safeguarding the amassed wealth. That is, abstaining from womanizing, from drunkenness, from gambling, and from evil friendship. And then this is like a tank in which you have the 4 inlets are open and the 4 outlets are closed. Then when the rain falls, the rainwater will be led into the tank and will be stored there. So one will then have abundant supply of water for one's family's use and for irrigation. Okay, so those are the 4 things that the Buddha mentions that lead to one's welfare and happiness in this present life. There are many other things that the Buddha mentions in other suttas, but these are very important basic requirements for a young man like this Vijayanu, who has to maintain a family with many children. Okay, now the Buddha will mention 4 things that are concerned with one's welfare and happiness in the future life. 4 things that lead to the development of wholesome qualities which will bring pleasant fruits in the future. Of course, these things will also lead to one's well-being and happiness here and now. One is faith, which for a follower of the Buddha means having faith in the enlightenment of the Buddha, accepting the Buddha in terms of the qualities that are traditionally ascribed to him. I will explain these later when we come to a later text. Okay, then the family man should be accomplished in moral discipline. And here the Buddha mentions the 5 precepts. The family man abstains from the destruction of life or killing, from stealing, from sexual misconduct, from false speech, and from the use of intoxicants, which lead to negligence or heedlessness. Okay, then the family man should be accomplished in generosity. And then here comes a fixed formula that the family man dwells at home with a mind devoid of the stain of stinginess or miserliness. He's generous, open-handed, one who delights in giving in charity, who delights in sharing his possessions with others, his wealth and possessions with others. Okay, and then the Buddha says that the family man should be accomplished in wisdom. So the Buddha just doesn't leave the family person with these good moral qualities, but also emphasizes that the family person should possess wisdom. And what's meant here is the wisdom of insight. So the family man possesses the wisdom that sees into the arising and passing away of phenomena. The wisdom that is noble, it transcends the ordinary level, and is penetrative, that penetrates into the real nature of things, and leads to the complete destruction of suffering, the wisdom that leads to final liberation. So this accomplishment in wisdom is actually a quality that pertains not to the second level of teaching, but to the third level of teaching. That it's a quality that leads to ultimate liberation. And so the Buddha expects the ideal family person, even though living with a wife and children and with working at a job, to be developing his mind in meditation, not maybe to the same extent as a renunciate person, a monk or nun can do, but there should be periods where he or she goes off into solitude, to seclusion, to devote the mind to the development of insight. Okay, so these are four things that lead to a family man's welfare and happiness in the future life. Okay, then we come into some texts that deal with right livelihood, or right way of living. And this is one factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. It's the fifth factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. And here the Buddha mentions specifically five trades, five professions that should not be taken up by a lay follower. These are forms of micca ajiva, or wrong livelihood. This is trading in weapons, trading in living beings, which can mean either trading in animals which are being raised for slaughter, like growing cattle, chickens, pigs, other animals that are just to be sold for slaughter. Trade, or it could also be interpreted as dealing in human beings, that is, operating a slave trade, or being the overseer of a prostitution ring, anything which involves owning human beings and then using them in ways that are harmful and destructive to them. Okay, the next one is trading in meat, trading in intoxicants like liquor and drugs, and trading in poisons. That is, poisons that are known, that it is known as to be used for harming other people. In our own day, we might be able to even multiply the types of wrong livelihood. And of course, various questions can arise with some degree of ethical ambiguity. If one is working in a chemical company which produces chemicals that are to be used in war, but one's own division is not producing those chemicals that are to be used for war. Should one continue to work there or not? There's no simple and straight answer to a question like that. Okay, then we come to a passage on the proper use of wealth. Now the Buddha is going to explain in a little more detail how a householder should use the wealth that he acquires, in more detail than he explained in that earlier sutta to the family man of the Kolya family. Okay, now the Buddha is speaking to his householder, to the householder named Anathapindika. And Anathapindika was the chief patron of the Buddha. According to one sutta, when the Buddha was beginning his mission, shortly after his enlightenment, he was based in the town of the city of Rajagaha. He was living in the bamboo grove at Rajagaha. And one gentleman of the town had invited the Buddha and the Sangha to come to his house for an alms offering. And this man was the brother-in-law of Anathapindika. And while the man was arranging the meal preparations before the Buddha and the Sangha came, even the day before he started the preparations, his brother-in-law Anathapindika came to visit him. Then, usually when Anathapindika would come to visit his brother-in-law would welcome him very happily, would offer him a seat, would provide him with refreshments, would engage in conversation with him. But on this day, Anathapindika turned up at the house, and his brother-in-law seemed almost not to notice him. He was always overseeing the cooks, seeing that they were preparing the food properly, seeing that the arrangements in the reception hall were properly set up. And so Anathapindika was wondering, what is going on here? Are you arranging for the marriage of your daughter? And he said, no. Is the king coming for a meal offering at your house tomorrow? The man said no. So then Anathapindika said, then why are you engaged in such elaborate preparations? Then his brother-in-law said, I've invited the Buddha and his Sangha to come to my house for an alms offering tomorrow morning. And at that time, Anathapindika had never heard of the Buddha. But when he heard this word Buddha, suddenly his kind of chills went through his body and he became ecstatic. And he asked his brother-in-law, did you say Buddha? Which they would know means the enlightened one. And the brother-in-law said, yes, I said the Buddha. And Anathapindika still couldn't believe it. And he said, did you say the Buddha? Again, his brother-in-law said, yes, I said the Buddha. Then Anathapindika thought, can there really be a Buddha living close by here? Then his brother-in-law said, yes, he's living in the bamboo grove just outside our city of Rajagaha. Then Anathapindika said, can I go to see him? The brother-in-law said, yes, you can go to see him, but it's dark already. It's not the proper time to go to the monastery. You should wait until the next morning. Okay, now, as soon as it started to get light, Anathapindika woke up and was ready to go. But he thought it's still too early, much too early. It must have been getting light at 3 a.m. in the morning in that part of India. Still too early to go. And so he would wait and wait, always waiting until he was almost very impatient for the day to turn light enough to go. Then finally, when it was light enough, he went, and to get to the bamboo grove from the house where he was staying, he had to pass through a cemetery. And when he went into the cemetery, suddenly he got frightened that there would be like spirits, goblins, ghosts waiting in the cemetery who might attack him. Then he was hesitating to go, and then some deva, some deity, appeared to him and told him, don't turn back, but go straight ahead. Go ahead for you would be better than acquiring 1,000 rupees, 1,000 wealthy, 1,000 mansions, 1,000 carriages yoked by thoroughbred horses. Go straight ahead, don't be afraid, don't turn back. And so then Anathapindika went to the bamboo grove, and when he arrived there, the Buddha was walking back and forth, and when the Buddha saw him, he said, "You are welcome, Sudatta." He called him by his personal name. And Anathapindika was astonished because he had never revealed his personal name. He doesn't reveal it publicly. Okay, so then Anathapindika came and he paid his respects to the Buddha. Then the Buddha gave him a short discourse, and at the end of it, Anathapindika became a stream enterer, a Sotapanna. Then Anathapindika thought that he could benefit many people in the city of Savatthi by inviting the Buddha and the Sangha to come to Savatthi. That was the city in northern India where he was living. And so Anathapindika asked the Buddha, "Will you come to Savatthi?" And the Buddha accepted. So then Anathapindika had the road from Rajagaha to Savatthi. He had the road smoothed out, not paved, that would have been a lot of work, but it had it well prepared so the passage would be easy from Rajagaha to Savatthi. Then he thought that in Savatthi he has to find a place suitable for the Buddha and the Sangha to live. And there was a prince, a son of the king, named Jeta, who had a woodland just outside the city of Savatthi, which was not being used for anything. It was just an enclosed woodland. And so Anathapindika went to Prince Jeta and said, "Would you sell me the grove that you have outside the city?" Prince Jeta was a bit miserly and said, "No, I won't sell it." Anathapindika pleaded with him, "Please sell it." Prince Jeta said, "No, I won't sell it." Anathapindika, "Please sell it." Prince Jeta says, "I'd sell it to you only if you could cover the entire grounds with gold bricks." He didn't know that Anathapindika was very wealthy and had many gold bricks. So Anathapindika covered the entire ground with gold bricks, except for one little corner. He didn't have enough gold bricks to cover one little corner. And Prince Jeta, he called Anathapindika, called Prince Jeta and said, "See what I've done? I've covered the entire ground except for one little corner with gold bricks." And Prince Jeta said, "Don't worry about that corner. I'll provide the gold bricks to cover it, and we can name this ground after both of us." And so in this way, Prince Jeta sold this grove to Anathapindika. And the grove came to be called Jetavana, Jeta's grove, and also Anathapindikata Arama, the monastery of Anathapindika. Okay, so then after buying Jeta's grove, Anathapindika transformed it into a nice monastery with a main building for preaching, a building for the monks to meet, to take their meals, and with individual huts or kutis for the monks, individual monks to stay for their meditation. Okay, so here the Buddha is addressing Anathapindika. Who is a wealthy merchant. Okay, so now the Buddha is going to explain how a householder uses his wealth. So he says, with the wealth acquired by energetic striving and so on, righteous wealth righteously gained, the noble disciple undertakes 4 worthy deeds. Okay, what are these 4 First, he makes himself happy and pleased and maintains himself in happiness. Then he makes his parents and family members and everybody in the household, slaves, workers, servants, happy and pleased, and properly maintains them in happiness. Then further, he makes his friends and colleagues happy and pleased, and properly maintains them in happiness. So you could say that the householder is using his wealth to practice generosity to support everybody in his household as well as his friends and colleagues. But again, he should be mindful not to spend beyond his means. Okay, then with the wealth that he's gained, the righteous wealth, he has to make provisions against possible losses. That is, he has to keep some amount in reserve as a kind of almost an insurance, since in those days they didn't have insurance companies, but this is the way a person would have personal insurance. So keep a certain amount as protection against losses that might arise on account of fire and floods. Again, kings and bandits and unloved heirs. Okay, then a noble disciple has to make 5 kinds of offerings. I guess that these were considered to be obligatory for any wealthy householder in India during this period. He would have to use a certain amount to provide to relatives, guests. When guests come, he has to be able to provide them with refreshments and entertainment. A certain amount must have to be used for offerings to the ancestors. Then he'd have to pay a certain amount in taxation to the king. And then a certain amount should be used for making offerings to the devas, the protective deities. Again, this is a belief in the period that in every district there would be special deities that are protective deities. Perhaps every profession has its own protective deities, and one would have to purchase incense, flowers, fruits to make offerings to them. And then, with the wealth that he has acquired, the noble disciple should establish a lofty offering of alms to ascetics and Brahmins. Since in the Buddha's time, as there are in Buddhist countries today, there's a large population of wandering ascetics who are not engaged in any kind of remunerative job, but they live by going on alms round and collecting their food, medicines, and other necessities as offerings from the lay community. Okay, so the noble disciple should establish a lofty offering of alms to those ascetics and Brahmins who refrain from vanity and negligence. This one has to be discriminating and choosing the right ones to make the generous offerings to. And by this description, the Buddha is also setting up certain standards that the ascetics should follow in order to be worthy of the offerings of people. They should be refrained from vanity and negligence. They should be settled in patience and gentleness, and should be devoted to taming themselves, to calming themselves, that's through development of the mind, and to attaining nirvana. And then this offering is described as heavenly, resulting in happiness conducive to heaven. So that is the 4th kind of use, the fourth kind of use to which the householder should put his wealth. Okay, and this kind of wealth, the Buddha says, is wealth that has gone to good use, to have been fruitfully employed and used for a worthy cause. Maybe I'll ask at this point if there's any questions relating to the text that I've covered so far. Yes, please.
Would most people have had access to others around the world? Hindu teachers who would have given this kind of advice, or is this the first time lay people who really get this very practical advice from religious leaders?
This is a question I can't really answer because I don't know so much about the teachings that were current at that period. Though I would think that some of these principles of advice would have probably been also shared by the other communities. So it would not be especially unique to the Buddha. So I think the Buddha, or at least the compilers of the Buddha's texts, arranged them into this very neat type of systemization. Yes? Oh, okay.
One is knowing the full source of these goals. How do we forgive ourselves, or how does a Buddhist work with that? And the other is, how do you relate to people who are not specifically Buddhist? Is this when you're talking about having good fellowship, is it talking to exclusively Buddhist fellowship, or is it talking to people who are moral in whatever?
Okay, let's take one question at a time. First, repeat the first question.
Knowing the full source,
Yeah.
how do we approach something that today we call forgiveness of self?
If one falls short of these standards, you mean? Not fall short of the income. Well, Buddhism doesn't emphasize harassing oneself with feelings of guilt, shame, self-condemnation, but just one recognizes that one has certain weaknesses, and then one just makes an effort to live up to the standards to the best of one's ability. Okay, then the second question.
It talks about like fellowship, and my question.
Okay, yeah. Whether it must be specifically Buddhist. I think that this advice on right fellowship in the Buddha's time could have been understood, or even in our own time, could be understood in a very general way. It doesn't necessarily mean associating with people who are specifically Buddhist. But here you take the basic qualities that are recommended. Well, for faith, the way the Buddha would understand it would be faith in the Buddha. But I think in a more general way, one could take this as faith in some kind of spiritual values, moral values. Okay, and then a person who has moral discipline, generosity, and wisdom. It could even be general wisdom in the general right conduct of life, rather than specifically in the Buddhist liberating wisdom. But of course, if one does have the opportunity to associate with people who have these qualities the way they're explained within the Buddhist tradition, then one should associate with those people, providing they are truly good friends.
Yeah, just to clarify that, because as I was listening and reading, yes, to associate people as friends for moral discipline. There's so many people in my life who try to find me who really are corrupt in many ways, who have very selfish methods of operating, and I feel that, should I abandon them? Should I be friends with them? Should I guide them along the path? It's not immediately the path of their life.
Yeah.
I'm finding difficulty with them. He's a very selfish person, and he's trying to reach out to me.
Okay, this is a very important question, because all of us are in situations like that. So I give my own advice, not quoting anything from the text, that if one can associate with a person who might not be up to very high standards in such a way that you could benefit that person, or at least that you can make some attempt to communicate to that person in order to transform them and help them lead their lives properly, then definitely one should associate with them. One shouldn't just abandon them and avoid them because they are not fulfilling high standards of proper conduct. But if you find that, you see, what is particularly, I think the point of the Buddha's advice is to avoid associating with people who are going to have a negative impact on oneself, who are going to pull one away from commitment to the path of spiritual development. Okay, take the question.
Three probably principal questions. The first one is at the start of this sutta, we find that the name of the man who asked the question is Divajana.
Yeah.
The two paragraphs later
Yeah.
is addressed by different names.
Yeah. Okay, that's a natural question. Yeah. You see, in India's time, just as in our own time, people had two names. One was a proper name, personal name, and the other was a family name. So my supposition here is that Divajana was his personal name in Jagapadja, which means something like tiger's foot. Must have been the family name. We'll find that in several discourses. The one on the caste system that comes later also one finds the same thing. The switch from the personal name, I think, to a clan name.
The second, in the answer you just gave, it reminded me of the I'm wondering if you can direct me to it, in which the Buddha talks about when it is appropriate to answer questions and not answer questions. And one of the features is if you believe that the person is able to get the answer at the right time. Do you know what any would is?
It doesn't exactly ring a bell.
My substantive question is on page 126 in Right License, where in the first selection, the trading of living beings, and two paragraphs down, we're told about slaves.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can help me if that's what up to the linguistic thing, or there's something else behind that.
Okay. People might want to first, the idea that trading in living beings means not being a slave trader. This is my interpretation. But then when I was reading that paragraph and I came across slaves, and the question came to my mind, was my interpretation right or not? But this is the fact that we have to accept. People might want to criticize the Buddha because he didn't reject slavery. But slavery was an established institution in the time of the Buddha. It was just part of life. In fact, in the whole ancient world, slavery was part of life. And it was not regarded as a terrible thing, because first of all, a monetary economy was just coming into being. And so the idea of hiring somebody to work for one as a hired laborer was just becoming a new concept. It was just being introduced But before the Buddha's time, there would be a working class who would seek employment with wealthy people as workers in their household, and they would not be given any kind of wages or monetary salary, but they would be given usually a small house where they could raise their family. They will receive food, even they will get vacations from time to time. And so what are called slaves would be treated generally very well, just like servants, except that they're not given a monetary salary, but they're provided with the basic requisites of life. Their condition would be not at all like the slaves during the period of pre-Civil War America. Slaves who were whipped, beaten, forced to live in extremely abject conditions, and just used for their labor. And in fact, in the sheet that I gave out last week on worshipping the six directions, the Buddha explains how a householder should treat their group together. Dasa, Kama, Purisa, which could be translated slaves, workers, and servants. They're all grouped together, and the distinctions between them are just very slight.
There's a similar question to that. This is about archery. This is effort in archery, and then again turns it and says it's not just a trade in weapons.
Yeah.
So it's really a question of if you're doing it or trading in it. Like if I smoke a cigarette is one thing, but if I trade in cigarettes it's another.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Yeah. The question of archery, I have to confess, I don't know how to answer. It struck me when I read that too, since one takes, the Buddha recommends or prescribes the precept to abstain from taking life. And I can't imagine what an archer does except train in archery in order to be employed in the king's service as a soldier, who's a kind of soldier whose task is going to be to shoot others and kill them. So, shooting animals perhaps, but I think the professional archers the ones who would kill animals would be called hunters, which is also a kind of livelihood that the Buddha doesn't recommend. But an archer, I don't see how an archer could do anything with his skill except use it for taking people's lives. I just don't know what to answer. It's just that the Buddha is quite consistent in prohibiting the taking of life.
So, my question, the prohibition of taking of life for human beings, is there ethical guidelines for dietary habits? There was vegetarianism that
Okay, this is an important point. And again, it might seem something a little bit inconsistent in Buddhism. But the Buddha himself did not prescribe, or he did not make vegetarianism mandatory. He didn't lay down regulations to lay people what they should eat, what they should not eat. And for monks, just certain types of meat are prohibited, which would be very unusual since people usually don't eat them. Things like lion's meat, tiger's meat, bear's meat, dog's meat. But first, in the case of the monks, the Buddhist monks would go door to door collecting alms from people often people that they don't know, haven't had previous connections with. And so the general advice is to accept whatever one is given. So if one is by principle vegetarian, one is free to reject fish or meat. But often monks who are leading quite rugged lives, having to walk many miles a day, eating only in the morning, often just one meal a day, they would just accept whatever is given. And so if people offer them fish or meat, they're allowed to accept it, except the Buddha mentions 3 conditions under which they can't accept fish or meat. One is if one sees an animal being killed, especially to prepare a meal for yourself. Second, if one hears from others that this animal was killed to prepare that meal for you. Or if one has some other ground for suspecting that an animal was killed, especially for oneself, then one has to refuse it. Wait, then the advice the Buddha gives to lay people, he gives the precept not to take life, not to cause the destruction of life. Okay, now in markets, in the Buddha's time, now, there was meat ready for sale. And so if lay people buy meat or fish which is already dead, already ready to sell, then the Buddha does not regard that as a violation of the precept. Because one doesn't have the intention of taking the life of a living being. The critical factor for the Buddha in ethical terms is the intention. Is one intending to take the life of the living being. I know it can be argued that just by purchasing the meat or fish, you are contributing to a process that sustains the meat industry. And maybe there's some validity to that argument. I have to say, if I were alive today, I would present that argument to the Buddha and see how he would answer.
I'd like to ask you.
Okay, we'll take one question, then I want to return to the text.
There's an argument for civil obedience, civil disobedience. Taking of life or eating or whatever is one issue. But as Gandhi rightly showed us, that there is an aspect of bullying and how you respond to the bully. And as a volunteer in national security prisons and seeing officers who bully inmates or inmates who bully officers, and when do you stand up? When do you stun them? This is a whole current issue in the society today.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of there's a new site on stun gun that police officers use that actually records the violence from the moment that the gun is shot. It turns on a camera. The whole of violence as a response to bullying.
Okay, this is a big question which takes depart somewhat from the text. What I would say is that first that there's a distinction between force and violence. Let us say that. So that force would mean that one can be resisting, say if somebody is bullying oneself, one can forcefully resist their bullying. Violence means that one applies force with the intention of seriously harming, seriously impairing, even killing the other person. So I would say that if one uses force to protect oneself from being bullied, from being attacked by others, then it's quite in accordance with the spirit of the Dhamma. But if one uses the force deliberately to inflict harm on somebody else, to injure them, to kill them, then one is going beyond the bounds of propriety. That's a very brief answer. Okay, now we can return to the text. I won't go through this text called The Family Man's Happiness. I think it's quite explicit. Then we come to a text on the women of the home. And here you have to remember, please, those who are women executives, lawyers, professional people, the Buddha is speaking in the context of Indian society. So the way he describes the proper way of life for a lay woman is based upon the conditions, the expectations in that society. Okay, so just as the Buddha explained 4 ways that lead to the well-being and happiness for a lay man, now he's explaining 4 ways that lead to present welfare and happiness for a lay woman. Okay, she's capable in her work, she manages the domestic health, she behaves in a way that is agreeable to her husband, and then 4th, very important, she safeguards his earnings. So the woman is conceived as one who's pretty much in charge of the household. So she is the one who is skillful and diligent in regard to the household chores. And then she investigates the appropriate means for accomplishing all of those chores, and she's able to act and to arrange everything properly. It's the exact same description that's used for the way the layman manages his profession. Okay, then the woman manages the domestic health. Okay, and she refers to them by the 3 terms, slaves, servants, and workers. She finds out directly, she knows for herself. She's like the manager of the household health. So she knows what they have done. She's the one who assigns them their chores, organizes the household, assigns them their chores, and she knows what each one has done, what they failed to do. She also has to keep track of when they are sick. So if they fall ill, then she will excuse them from their work and provide medicine for them, call a doctor to examine them. And then she distributes to each the appropriate share of food. She makes sure that all receive sufficient food. So in this way, a woman manages the domestic health, and the ideal woman is depicted in early Buddhism as one who is deeply loved by all of her workers and subordinates. Then the woman has to behave in a way that's agreeable to her husband. I know this might create some problems. Try to enforce this today. And then the 4th is that the woman safeguards her husband's earnings. If you looked at the sheet I gave out last week, which explained the ways in which the wife supports her husband, the way the husband behaves in relation to the wife, he turns over his earnings to the wife. And his wife takes possession of the earnings and is one who keeps watch over them, who protects them. So whatever her husband brings back, whether money or grain, gold or silver, she protects it and guards it. And she is not a spendthrift who wastes the wealth, who squanders it, but she keeps watch over it. Okay, then the Buddha will also explain 4 qualities that lead to welfare and happiness in the future life. And these are exactly the same four that I explained earlier in relation to the householder. That's faith, moral discipline, generosity, and wisdom. Okay, in the next section we deal with the Buddha's teaching in relation to larger social units. Even though the Buddha didn't placed himself in the position of a social reformer, did not make extensive attempts to consciously and deliberately reform a whole society, but still he taught basic principles which one could say can form a foundation for a society which is both successful and prosperous, and at the same time just and righteous. One passage that's relevant to establishing social harmony concerns the 6 roots of dispute. This sutta arose close to the time of the Buddha's passing away, when the Buddha had to give advice to the Sangha, so that the Sangha could adhere as a unified community without disputes arising that would lead to divisions and schisms within the Sangha. And so the Buddha here teaches what he calls 6 roots of dispute, but actually he mentions altogether about 12 or 13 qualities. I think 11 qualities that lead to disputes. So the first 10 he groups he links together in pairs. Okay, the first is anger and resentment or hostility. And what happens when a monk dwells angry and resentful, when a monk is angry and resentful, then he loses respect and deference towards the teacher, that's the Buddha, towards the Dhamma, and towards the Sangha, and he does not fulfill the training. Then when he is not attempting to fulfill the training, then he'll be inclined to create a dispute in the Sangha. And then the Buddha says that this will be for the harm and unhappiness of many, for the loss, harm, and suffering of devas and humans. Then he gives the advice to the monks. He says, if you see such a root of dispute in yourselves or in others, then you should strive to abandon that same evil root of dispute. But if you don't see any root of dispute in you, then you should just continue to practice in such a way that that same evil root of dispute does not arise in the future. Okay, then he makes the same statement about contempt and insolence. That forms the second root of dispute. Then envy and niggardliness or miserliness. Then deceitfulness and fraudulence. It's explained that deceitfulness is, I think, trying to cover up real faults that one has, and fraudulence is pretending to have virtues and good qualities that one does not really have. Okay, the fifth is called evil wishes and wrong view. Evil wishes would mean a strong wish for name and fame, wish to be admired by others. Of course, naturally one could have a wish like that, but when it becomes a kind of obsessive wish that pits one against others, that's what one has to be careful of. And then wrong view would be a kind of view which denies the basic principles of the Buddha's teachings. And then the sixth root of dispute is adhering to one's own views and opinions, holding on to them tenaciously and relinquishing them with difficulty. Of course, this doesn't mean that if one has a position or a view that one shouldn't try to defend it, But sometimes it becomes very not at all unusual for somebody to take a particular view, and even though one could see from the argument, one could see that this view is clearly wrong, but the person, because it's his opinion, continues to hold to it, thinking, this is my opinion, my view, my understanding, I have to protect it. And so that person will just cling to their own views, they'll not show any kind of softness, readiness to compromise, to understand other people's positions, but just they use their own view as a kind of tool for attacking others and for defending or bolstering themselves. Okay, then at the same time, the Buddha taught 6 principles that lead to harmony or concord within a community. He calls these the 6 principles of cordiality that create love and respect and lead to cohesion, to non-disputing, to concord and unity. Okay, of course these are being taught through the Sangha, and so they're explained in a way that's relevant to the life of the monk. First, a monk maintains bodily acts of loving kindness towards his companions in the spiritual life. So he will do things to help others. He'll always show himself ready to be of service to his fellow monks and do little deeds that will be acts of kindness towards them. Then he maintains verbal acts of loving kindness, both in public and in private, towards his companions in the spiritual life. So he will speak well of them. He'll speak, when speaking directly to them, he'll speak gently and softly, not harshly and angrily. And he'll always be polite in his speech. The third is that he maintains mental acts of loving kindness towards his companions in the holy life. That is, he will think of them with loving kindness. Okay, then the fourth is that he will enjoy things or use things in common with his fellow monks. So whatever gains he makes, he will share with his fellow monks. So for example, if he goes on alms round and collects a lot of food, but another monk collects just a little food, then he'll share what he gains with others. So it's very common in the Sangha that when people offer things to monks, they just take as much as they need for themselves, and then their surplus they will distribute to other monks. Then, to keep the Sangha unified, the 5th principle is to possess or to observe in common with his fellow monks those virtues, that is, the precepts that are unbroken, untorn, unblemished, unmottled, liberating, praised by the wise, ungrasped, and that lead to samadhi, to concentration. And then the 6th principle is to hold in common with his fellow monks the same basic view of the Dhamma, which the Buddha describes as a view that's noble and emancipating, and that leads the one who practices in accordance with it to the complete destruction of suffering. So we have these 6 principles of harmony and respect. Okay, now I'm not going to go through this text on the caste system or class system in the Buddha's time, since you could read it on your own, but I'll just make some general remarks about the Buddhist attitude towards caste. It's sometimes thought or said that the Buddha was a social reformer who tried to abolish the caste system. Actually, this isn't quite true. First, the caste system that we have in India today did not exist as such in the time of the Buddha, with many different castes, each with their precise duty, with fixed barriers of marriage and interrelationships. But there was a general division of society into four broad social classes. The Brahmins, who were the specialists in the Vedic scriptures, whose task was to perform the religious observances, and especially the sacrifices. Their services were often sought by the king and by other wealthy people to perform sacrifices that were intended to promote well-being and happiness. The Buddha rejected this concept of sacrifice in the sense of the destruction of animals or the destruction of material things as a way to produce well-being and happiness. Instead, he replaced this concept of sacrifice with that of generosity or charity. But the first class was that of the Brahmins. The second class is the class of the Khatiyas or Kshatriyas. These are the rulers, the administrators, also the chief officers in the army. It was originally the warrior caste. Then come the Vaishyas or Vaisas. These are the merchants and the cultivators. And then the Sudras or workers, laborers. And below them, the people who are considered outside the class system. These were probably originally tribal people who became absorbed into the wider Indian social system. Now the Buddha took his main task to be that of a spiritual teacher, not that of a social reformer. It probably would have been too much beyond his capacity to change the social system that was prevalent in India during that period. But what the Buddha did first within his own monastic order, he permitted ordination or gave ordination to members of any social class, even those outside the class system. And he said that just as the water of the four great oceans, the water of the four great rivers, when it flows into the ocean, the water gives up its name as the water from the river Ganges, the water from the Achiravati River, the water from the Maha River, and so on. And it all becomes known simply as the water of the ocean. So the Buddha says, when anybody from any of the four social classes goes forth into my dispensation, my order of monks and nuns, they give up their name and caste identification, their class identification. They give up their clan name, their class identification, and they all become known simply as ascetics who are followers of the Sakyan son, that's the Buddha. Okay, and when the Buddha spoke more generally about the structure of society to people who were following his teaching, he spoke of kshatriyas, the warriors, administrators, the Brahmins, and then he used the expression gahapati, which means householders. He didn't make a distinction between the Vaishyas and the Sudras, the cultivators and the workers. So he set up a social system in which there remained Brahmins, because the Buddha didn't want to directly try to challenge the Brahmins to their position as having some privileged position within society. And there would be necessary the kshatriyas as the rulers and administrators of the society, but everybody else becomes known simply as householders. And then when the Buddha encountered the claims of the Brahmins, that the Brahmins were some kind of divinely privileged social group, the Buddha rejected and refuted that claim. At that time, the Brahmins would claim that they were created by the god Brahma directly from his mouth, and that they had certain special privileges that were to be denied to others. But the Buddha argued in various ways against these claims of the Brahmins. And we could see some of these arguments laid out in this sutta that comes on pages 132 to 137. In the Buddha's time, there were two main types of social groups, two main types of political organization in society. One was the republics, small tribal republics, and the other were kingdoms or monarchies. And what was characteristic of the period in which the Buddha lived was that the kingdoms were starting to expand and to swallow up the older tribal republics, which were breaking down and becoming encompassed by the expanding monarchies. And what the Buddha was aware of this change taking place within the political forms of organization of the period. And what he especially tried to do was to lay down some type of moral guidance for the king. Because as the kingdoms expanded and kings became more and more powerful, the kings came to exert almost an arbitrary exercise of their power. Kings came to feel that they were entitled to do anything that they wanted. And so kings were becoming transformed into tyrants, ambitious, greedy for more, larger territories, ready to risk war in order to expand their domains. And so during the Buddha's time, there were constant warfare going on, especially during the later part of the Buddha's life, between the kingdom of Kosala under the good king Sasenadi and the kingdom of Magadha, which came under the control of a parasite king named Ajatasattu. And so the Buddha tried to put some check, some control on a king's ability to exercise his power arbitrarily by establishing an ideal concept of kingship. And this took the form of what is called the wheel-turning monarch, who is described as a just and righteous king. The wheel-turning monarch is something of a legendary or mythical figure, but it's by creating this concept, this mythical concept of the wheel-turning monarch, that the Buddha is able to establish an ideal for kings to follow in their administration of their kingdom. And what's characteristic of the wheel-turning monarch is that he subjects his own rule to a higher moral law of righteousness. This is the Dhamma itself, not in the sense of the Buddha's teaching, but Dhamma in the sense of a universal, impersonal principle of virtue and righteousness. So a monarch, to be truly worthy of the throne that he might inherit from his father, has to fulfill the ethical principles that are intrinsic to the concept of proper kingship. And these are the duties of the wheel-turning monarch. We have them described on page 140, paragraph 5. The king should establish righteous guard, ward, and protection for his own household, the troops, the khatiyas, the vassals, for Brahmins and householders, for the people of the town and country, for ascetics and Brahmins, for beasts and birds. And then an important point comes next. He says, let no crime prevail in your kingdom, and to those who are in need give wealth. That is, it's an obligation of the king to ensure that there will not be people in his kingdom suffering from poverty. If there are poor people, the king has to rectify this by giving them wealth so that they can establish a proper livelihood for themselves and support their families. And then the additional advice to the king is that from time to time he should go and consult with the ascetics and Brahmins in their kingdom who have renounced the worldly life of sensual pleasures and who are devoted to taming themselves, calming themselves, and striving for liberation. The king should approach them and ask them for advice about what is wholesome, what is unwholesome, what is blameworthy, what is blameless, what is to be followed, and what is not to be followed. And then after he receives their advice, the king should follow that advice. He should avoid what is unwholesome and do what is wholesome. And this, by doing so, this will avoid harm and suffering to the people in his kingdom and will promote their welfare and happiness. And then in passage 6 on page 141, we have an example of how a king provides wealth to those who are poor in his kingdom. At this time, there was a king named Mahavijita, who was rich and wealthy with abundant gold and silver. And in the kingdom, there was a lot of criminal activity taking place. And the king, in order to establish prosperity in his kingdom, wanted to perform a great sacrifice. And so he goes to his advisor, his Brahmin advisor, and says that I want to make a great sacrifice that will be for my welfare and happiness. Tell me how to do so. And then his advisor explains that now the country is beset by thieves, villages and towns are being destroyed, and the countryside is infested with brigands. Now, if you want to perform a great sacrifice, then you have to tax the region, and that would oppress the people even more. So how can you get rid of these problems in your country? This is the advice the chaplain gives. To those who are engaged in cultivating crops and raising cattle, you should give grain and fodder. To those who are engaged in trade, give capital. To those in government service, give them their proper living wages. Then those people, being intent on their own occupations, will not harm the kingdom. Your revenues will increase. The land will be tranquil and not beset by thieves. And the people, with joy in their hearts, playing with their children, will dwell in houses with their doors open. Then the king accepts the chaplain's advice, does everything that he says, and everything that the chaplain said would happen. The land becomes prosperous, and the people are able to live happily, playing with their children, dwelling in houses with the doors open. Okay. Now I'll ask for some questions, please.
It seems to me that what you just referred to, is number 11, is in the kingdom to give each of these subjects, each of the principles living in that kingdom, their due to the cattle, the farmer, give. It's an act of giving, as a magisterial act of giving to each and every person. That, to me, seems like it speaks to a better understanding of karma than we have inherited. We now seem to think, I believe, in our society, that whatever is in your life is your karma, your fault, your problem, your responsibility. But here it says that you could actually transform the lives of the people through generosity.
That is true.
Understanding that karma is it's not for me to understand your karma. It's for me to give.
Karma isn't predestination. I think the next class we start to come into the concept of karma.
And it seems to reveal that in this passage, that it's the giving and the generosity that leads to tranquility regardless of an individual's karma that we see.
Further questions? Yes.
This is a big thing that's been established for a while, and it seems to come up in gray areas sometimes with Buddhism. It seems to depend on teaching. Now, I understand that in the Buddhist times, that the monks went around and they each to accept whatever offerings came as part of vegetarian lifestyle. This is a very low price business. It is my understanding, without doubt, that Buddhism promotes vegetarian lifestyle. In this very temple, everything is vegetarian. You mentioned that the lay people, it was okay for them to go to the market to buy meat. It doesn't seem like there's any gray area to me there. The precepts are very clear about not consuming alcohol, what they do not do, certain things. In our time, people come to me, and I have learned from this great teaching that I do not my own children not vegetarian, I will not push that on them.
Wait, I didn't catch it.
Yes.
I didn't catch it.
I have learned that it's not pushing vegetarianism on people. My own children are not vegetarian because I will not promote that because we have to come. But isn't it clear, especially in our time, in modern Buddhism, that even lay people, because you mentioned lay people back then would go to the market to buy meat, but if we are practicing Buddhists that we shouldn't try to become vegetarians, we don't know where our meat is being killed, what's happening to it. And even if it were, if I had an animal in my backyard and was raising pigs, they would have the right to live as far as I see it.
Yeah.
So I'm just asking you, is it definite that Buddhism is geared towards those being vegetarians as a sanctity of life?
I would say that vegetarianism is an ideal standard in Buddhism, but the Buddhisms make it compulsory. And here, again, the decisive factor is intention. And the way the Buddha looks at it, when one goes to the market and purchases meat which is already prepared, one is not intentionally responsible for the death of that animal. As I said, I know that there can be a counter-argument.
I have a very big problem with that.
Yeah.
I have to respectfully say that maybe it was back in that time people had a hard time eating.
Yeah.
I had a very, and I tell them not push vegetarianism on anybody.
Okay.
I want that forever again.
Yeah.
Respectfully, I don't understand.
Okay, I think I said what I have to on that issue. Are there any other questions? Yes, please.
In this final section, we were describing there was advice given to the monarch about what to do with people who already have vocations and activities, but no advice was given to people who are out doing the robbing who didn't have a vocation.
Well, I think the idea here is that the people who are doing the robbing in this passage are those who were formerly, sort of by their upbringing, either cow farmers, growing crops, who might have been formerly working at some other trade, but now they're not able to conduct their ordinary type of way of living, their ordinary livelihood. And so in order to be able to survive, they have to resort to robbery. I think probably what the Buddha would say if there were robbers who were not coming from these other professions, have them trained for some kind of profession that they can earn their living in a way which doesn't involve harm to others. Okay, let us take questions. Yes.
The Buddha has so much practical information that he could give this kind of advice. Do you think it came from watching his own father as a king, or maybe how practical?
Yes, I have to say some of these similes I could see come from his past experience, but he must have been extremely observant about so many different spheres of life. Like he described in some similes, the process through which a goldsmith refines gold. Now, I don't think the Buddha himself would have had experience refining gold, and yet he'll describe the different stages of the process. I have to say, a lot of this comes through the inherent knowledge of Buddhahood, just knowing so many different aspects, the different stages by which an elephant trainer trains an elephant, so that he might have observed himself. Any further questions?
I have a textual question, very minor. On page 141, it talks about the king bingo gold on the turning wheel. And then it says something about the king's fourfold army will follow. What does it mean by the king's fourfold army?
Horse soldiers, elephant soldiers, charioteers, and foot soldiers. Okay, I think we'll have to stop now. Henry, you'll have a discussion?
Yes. So when people who are interested in further discussion, sharing their views, they go to the VIP room after the class.
Okay, so our next class will be next Saturday, that is November 10th, and we do the first part of the chapter on the way to a fortunate rebirth. The pages are marked in the syllabus. I think it's up to page 166. Okay, we end by sharing the merits. This is to share the merits of speaking the Dhamma, listening to the Dhamma, discussing the Dhamma. Share the merits with the Devas, the Nagas or dragon spirits, Bhutas or fear spirits, asking them to protect the Dhamma, to protect the world, to protect ourselves and others. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantam anumoditva Tirang rakantu sasanam Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantam anumoditva Tirang rakantu desanam Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantam anumoditva Tirang rakantu mantarang Etavata amhehi sampadang punya sampadang Sabbe deva anumodantu Sabba sampati siddhya Etavata amhehi sampadang punya sampadang Sabbe bhuta anumodantu Sabba sampati siddhya Etavata amhehi sampadang punya sampadang Sabbe sata anumodantu Sabba sampati siddhya Pavadupadaya visi-hetato Etantare satakayupapanna Rupi arupi cha asanya sanyino Dukha pamuchantu pusantu ni